Wyoming Territory, 1877. The wind blew hard across the dry grass outside the town of Red Birch, kicking dust over the wagon wheels and the worn boots of those who had nowhere else to be. Gwenna Keller stood on the edge of the church steps, her hands shaking as she clutched the frayed strap of her satchel. The front door slammed behind her, the sound sharp and final. Reverend Moore's voice still rang in her ears. "You have no dowry, no property, and no standing, Miss Keller. My son deserves a proper match." She blinked fast, trying not to cry, but the tears came anyway. Not loud, just quiet ones that slid down her cheeks and caught on her collar. She had not been in love with Joseph Moore, but she had hoped for kindness. She had hoped for a life. She had hoped to be chosen. Instead, she had been turned away like a beggar. The street was half empty, the hour too early for saloon noise and too late for deliveries. Gwenna stepped off the boardwalk, her boots dragging through the dirt. She passed the general store where Mrs. Whitney turned her face away. She passed the bakery, where the scent of warm bread made her stomach twist. She had not eaten since the day before. She did not notice the man leaning against the corral post until he stepped forward. "You all right, miss?" She blinked at him. He was tall, with sun-browned skin, a square jaw and eyes the color of stormy skies. His hat was pulled low, and his shirt was dusty from trail riding, but his voice was gentle. "I'm fine," she said, even though her voice cracked. He looked at her for a long second, then reached into his coat and handed her a red apple. She stared at it. "I don't have any money." "Didn't ask for any," he said. She took it. Her hands were cold and trembling. She bit into the apple and closed her eyes. She had not realized how hungry she was. "I'm Cade Holloway," he said. "Just rode in from the Southern Trail." She wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve. "Gwenna Keller." He nodded, then looked past her toward the church. "They do something to you up there." She hesitated. "They said I was too poor to marry their son." Cade's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "Then they are fools." She gave a bitter laugh. "They said I have nothing to offer." He stepped closer. His boots stopped just inches in front of hers. "That's not what I see." She looked up, surprised. "What do you see?" Cade reached out and gently took her hand. His palm was warm and rough with calluses. "I see someone who kept their head up while being thrown out. Someone who says thank you even when they are hungry. Someone who is rich in all the ways that matter." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to her. "You don't even know me." "Then let me." She did not pull her hand away. They walked together down the street, past the livery and the feed store. He asked her where she lived, and she told him the truth: nowhere. Since her aunt's death, she had been taking in washing and sleeping in the back of the dressmaker's shop when she could. Cade listened without interrupting. He did not offer pity, just quiet, steady interest. At the edge of town, he stopped beside his horse. "I've got a small cabin out near the ridge. It is not much, but it has a roof, a warm stove, and a clean cot. You're welcome to it until you find your footing." She hesitated. "Why are you being kind to me?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "Because you deserve it." The next morning, Gwenna woke beneath a warm quilt in a small cabin that smelled like pine smoke and coffee. Cade had already gone out to tend to the horses, but he had left her breakfast on the table: eggs, toast, and another apple. She sat down, hands wrapped around the mug, and watched the light move across the wooden floor. For the first time in months, she did not feel like she was surviving. She just felt alive. Later that week, he asked her if she wanted to ride out with him to check the fence lines. She had never ridden a horse alone before, but he gave her a gentle mare and walked beside her until she got the hang of it. They rode along the ridge, where the mountains touched the sky, and she laughed for the first time in weeks. He turned in the saddle to look at her, his eyes catching the light, and something soft passed between them. "You laugh like you mean it," he said quietly. I do, she said. One night, a storm rolled in hard and fast. Gwenna stood at the window, watching the lightning split the sky. Cade came in from the barn, soaked to the skin. She rushed forward, taking his coat and hanging it near the stove. You should not have gone out, she said, voice tight with worry. He looked at her, water dripping from his hair. The horses needed settling. She stepped closer and pressed a towel into his hands. You do not always have to be the one fixing things. He caught her wrist before she could pull away. Maybe I want to. They were close now, the air between them warm and charged. She looked up at him and he brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. I meant what I said, he whispered. You are not poor, Gwenna, not to me. You are the richest thing I have ever known. Her heart beat fast, but she did not look away. Then stay close. He leaned forward, slow and sure, and kissed her. It was not rushed. It was steady. Like him. Like everything he had given her since the moment he stepped off that corral rail. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the rain on the roof. She was not rejected anymore. She was chosen. And she was not alone. By late May, the last patches of snow had melted from the ridge behind the cabin, leaving the ground soft and dark with promise. Cade had turned the soil near the lean-to for a vegetable plot, and Gwenna knelt beside him, planting rows of beans with fingers stained by earth instead of laundry starch. Did you grow things back east? Cade asked, brushing soil from his palms. No, she said, reaching for another seed. Not unless you count patience. He chuckled low in his throat. That grows best when watered with trouble. She glanced up at him, sunlight catching the curve of his cheek. Then you must have fields of it. He shook his head, settling on his heels as he surveyed their work. I had to learn the hard way that not every fight's worth the bruises, but the ones that are, they stay with you. Gwenna brushed a strand of hair from her temple. What kind of fight stayed with you? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he picked up the trowel and began carving a new line along the soil. My mother died when I was 14. My father put a bottle in her place. I left at 16 and never looked back. She didn't speak, just pressed her palm against the dirt, anchoring herself. I worked cattle in Montana, drove freight wagons through Dakota territory, even tried my hand at sheep herding once. But I never cared for any of it long, he went on, his voice steady. Never stayed more than a season anywhere. Gwenna's eyes stayed on the ground. So why stay now? He paused, trowel still in hand. Because for the first time I want to. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wild sage up from the valley. She didn't answer with words, only pressed another seed into the earth and covered it with care. That evening, as dusk gathered along the ridge, Gwenna sat on the step with a scrap of mending in her lap. Cade came up from the barn, his shirt darkened at the collar from sweat and dust. I saw a doe and 2 fawns down by the creek, he said, easing down beside her. They were standing so still I thought they were carved. She nodded, biting off a thread. I've never seen a fawn. I'll take you down at sunup. They feed early. She folded the mended shirt and set it aside. I used to think mornings were the worst part of a day. Cade leaned back on his elbows, watching the last light bleed from the sky. And now I wake up and I know I'll be seen. He turned his head toward her, quiet settling between them. She met his gaze, and the space between them felt tender, unspoken. I want to build something here, she said finally, her voice low. Not just survive it. His eyes didn't leave hers. You already are. They rose before dawn the next morning and walked the trail in silence. The air still held the night's cold, and Gwenna kept her shawl tight around her shoulders. Cade carried his rifle slung across his back but made no move to reach for it. They stopped where the trees thinned beside the creek. Mist clung to the low brush, and the water moved quiet and dark between the stones. Gwenna touched his arm. Across the clearing, 3 shapes moved with gentle purpose. The fawns stayed close, their legs wobbling as they stepped through shallow pools. She watched them with wide eyes. "They're smaller than I imagined. They'll get strong fast, they have to." She looked at him then, not at the deer. "Like us." His hand found hers, worn palm folding over her fingers. "Exactly like us." Later that week, with the first green shoots breaking through the soil, Gwenna stood inside the cabin sorting a bundle of worn muslin she'd found in the back of the cupboard. She'd decided to make curtains, something simple and soft to hang at the windows. She hadn't sewn for herself in years, but her hands remembered the rhythm. Cade came in with a strip of bark in one hand. "Found this near the ridge trail. Thought you might like to draw on it." She set the muslin aside. "How did you know I draw?" he shrugged, setting the bark on the table. "The way you looked at the fawns, like you were storing every line in your mind." She ran her fingers along the rough grain. "I used to sketch faces, mostly, people I'd never meet. It made the world feel wider." He reached for her wrist, not rough, just steady. "Draw this life, Gwenna." "Not the world you imagined. The one you're in," she swallowed. "I don't know if I know how," he smiled, and it was quiet. "You're learning." That night, she lit the oil lamp early and sat at the table, sketching the shape of the ridge, the curve of the creek, the tight curls of a fawn's back. Cade read beside the hearth, his boots off, one arm draped over the back of the chair. They didn't speak much, but something passed between them, familiar and slow and certain, and when the lamp burned low, Gwenna looked up and said, "I think I'm beginning to see it." He didn't ask what. He just said, "Me too," and reached for her hand across the table. By mid-June, the days stretched long and golden, and the ridge trail buzzed with bees thick among the wild lupine. Gwenna sat beside the open window, stitching a hem for the churchwoman's daughter while scent from the pine trees drifted in. A knock at the door pulled her from her work. Cade stepped inside, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Got word from town," he said. The Harrow's second boy came back from Cheyenne with a wagon full of tools. "They're asking if anyone's willing to help raise a new barn." She set her needle down. "You planning to go?" He nodded, setting the cloth aside. "I owe Tom Harrow a favor. He lent me a mule once when I was stuck out by the flats." "I'll pack you something," she said, standing. He reached for her hand. "Come with me," she hesitated. "They still remember what happened at the church." "I know." His voice was low, steady. "But you don't have to let them decide who you are." She looked at the floor, then back at him. "Will they even speak to me?" "They'll have to," he said, voice firm. "You'll be standing next to me." They rode into Red Birch the next morning, the wagon creaking under a load of spare timber and wrapped bread loaves. People glanced their way as they passed. The shoemaker nodded, the blacksmith tipped his chin. Gwenna kept her gaze forward. At the Harrow homestead, men had already begun digging post holes and hauling lumber. Children darted between tool piles, and the smell of hot iron and sawdust filled the air. Mrs. Harrow met them at the gate, her apron stained with flour. "You're a welcome sight," she said to Cade, wiping her hands. Then she looked at Gwenna, her expression unreadable. "And you?" Gwenna nodded. "I brought bread." Mrs. Harrow took the basket. "We'll need it." They worked through the heat of the day. Cade hauled beams with the older boys while Gwenna joined the women folding tarpaulins and mixing water for the mortar. No one spoke of the past. They asked her to pass things, thanked her when she did, and by the time the sun dipped low, there were blisters on her hands and a quiet ache in her legs, and no one had turned her away. That evening, when the barn's skeleton stood tall against the dusk and the supper fire crackled with beans and salt pork, Cade found her sitting apart on a low stump, rubbing her palms. "You held your own," he said, crouching beside her. "They didn't look through me," she whispered. They wouldn't dare. She turned her face toward him. I didn't think I'd ever belong again. You don't have to belong to them. He brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You belong with me. She didn't speak, only rested her head on his shoulder. The next morning they lingered on the porch of the cabin, sipping coffee while the sun crept over the pines. Cade leaned against the post, watching the steam rise from his tin cup. Got another letter from my brother, he said. He's settled near Sheridan. Says there's good grazing land and a small schoolhouse for the neighbors' kids. She sipped quietly. He asked if I'd come and help him run cattle. He's got more land than hands. She looked up. Would you go? He watched the horizon for a long moment. Not if it meant leaving this ridge. She set her cup down. Then what are you thinking? I'm thinking we could go together. Build something there or build it here. Doesn't matter where, long as it's with you. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. I want to stay, she said. This place, this cabin, it's the only thing that's ever felt earned. He nodded. Then we make it ours. By late summer, the plot behind the cabin held rows of beans, squash vines curling around the fence posts, and a tidy coop that Cade built with leftover pine. Gwenna hung lengths of dried sage in the kitchen and kept her sketches in a tin box beneath the bed. One evening, as the sun slid behind the ridge, she took his hand and led him behind the house. She had laid out a blanket beside the rows of vegetables, where the earth still held the day's warmth. I want to ask you something, she said. He sat beside her, watching her face. Go on. If I stitched us a wedding quilt, would you let me fill it with every color I've seen since coming here? He smiled, slow and sure. Only if you promise to sleep beneath it with me every night. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. Every night. And when the stars came out, they stayed there silent, steady, and certain, wrapped in each other and everything they'd grown. The first frost came early that year, silvering the cabin roof before the leaves had fully turned. Gwenna stood at the edge of the garden, pulling the last of the squash vines, her breath showing faint in the morning air. Cade was splitting cedar by the woodshed, his shirt sleeves rolled, shoulders moving in rhythm with each swing. Gwenna wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to him. We'll need to smoke the rest of the meat this week. Cold's coming faster than I thought. He leaned on the axe handle, nodding. I'll bring down another deer tomorrow. Might be our last chance before the snow thickens. She looked toward the hills. It still feels like summer in my bones. I forget what time it is until I see my breath. You'll remember when your fingers won't move before the fire's been lit. She smiled lightly, then reached into her pocket. I found this while turning the soil yesterday. She handed him a weathered brass button, the edge worn smooth. He turned it over in his palm. Army issue, maybe from a cavalryman. You think he lost it in a fight, could be, or maybe he just leaned too hard over a fence. She tilted her head. You always make things sound simpler than they are. I reckon most things are. It's us that tangle them up. He slipped the button into his shirt pocket and brushed a bit of bark from her cheek. You want to come with me tomorrow, on the hunt? I've never held a rifle. I'll carry it. You carry your eyes. They left before dawn, riding single file through the narrow pass where the trees grew tight and the moss hung low. Cade pointed out tracks: elk, fox, once even mountain lion, and Gwenna leaned forward in the saddle, watching the signs with growing steadiness. At a clearing where the pines opened wide, he reined in and dismounted. We'll wait here. Wind's in our favor. She crouched beside him in the brush, her skirts tucked beneath her knees, watching the line of trees for movement. The silence stretched long, filled only by the occasional creak of leather and the rustle of unseen wings above them. After a while, Gwenna whispered, "Did you ever hunt for need, not choice?" He kept his eyes on the distant tree line. "I have. Once in Dakota Territory." My horse went lame, food ran out. I walked 3 days to find a rabbit, cooked it on a fire so small it barely warmed my hands. She glanced at him. And now you hunt to fill a root cellar we built together. He looked at her then, eyes steady. That's the difference between hunger and home. A buck stepped into the clearing, head high, ears twitching. Cade raised the rifle and fired clean. The animal went down without a sound. They approached together. Gwenna knelt beside the still body, resting a hand on its flank. "Thank you," she murmured. Cade watched her. "You don't have to say it." "I want to." They dressed the meat in silence, working in rhythm the way they always did. The sun rose behind them, catching on the frost that still clung to the grass. That night back in the cabin, Gwenna rolled out dough while Cade hung strips of venison over the smoke rack. The fire snapped and hissed, throwing shadows across the walls. "I thought about the button," she said, dusting flour from her hands. He looked over from the hearth. "What about it?" "I think it came off someone who lost something more than a coat." Cade nodded once. "You've got a feel for stories." She crossed to him, reaching into the small cupboard above the stove. "I want to keep it, not for the army. For the reminder." He took the jar from her hands, setting it gently beside the fire. "Of what?" "That even things left behind can be found again, just not always the way they were." He crossed the space between them, voice low. "You think that's what we are, something found?" She met his gaze. "I think we're something made." He touched her cheek, his hand warm from the fire. "Then let's keep making it." Outside, the wind had risen, rustling the trees like a river through branches. Inside, the cabin held steady wood walls, slow fire, and two people who had chosen each other not in haste, but in the quiet work of days shared. That night, as they lay side by side beneath the quilt, Gwenna was still stitching. She traced the seams with her fingers. "Do you remember that morning I met you?" she asked. Cade shifted, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. "You were walking away from something that never deserved you, and you were leaning against the corral fence like you'd been waiting all your life." He smiled without speaking. She turned toward him, the hush of the hour wrapping around them. "I never thought I'd be enough." "You've always been more than enough," he said, voice thick with sleep and truth. And when the first snow fell the next morning, soft as ash across the ridge, they watched it together from the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his knee, the warmth between them deeper than fire. The snow deepened through November, dry and powder fine, blanketing the ridge and softening the sound of every step. Gwenna moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, laying thick quilts over the doors at night and baking bread with the last stores of flour. Cade split wood each morning before the sun crested the ridge, his breath rising in pale clouds as he worked. One afternoon, while Gwenna was mending the hem of her winter dress, Cade stepped inside carrying a small box carved from juniper. He set it on the table without a word. She looked up from her stitching. "What's this?" He took off his gloves and sat across from her. "Something I started carving before the frost came. Thought maybe you'd keep your sketches in it." She opened the lid slowly. The inside was lined with soft wool, clean and pale. Along the edges, he'd etched shallow shapes, mountains, a deer, the curve of a woman's braid. Her breath caught. "You did this with that little blade of yours," he nodded. "Took longer than I figured." The wood kept warping near the grain. She ran her thumb over the mountain ridge carved along the top. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever made for me. I wanted to hold something important." She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "It does." Later that week, they rode into town together for supplies. The snow had settled thick along the road, but the wagon moved steady behind the mare. Gwenna held the reins while Cade checked the trail ahead, his rifle strapped across his back in case of wolves. At the general store, she traded her last length of muslin for salt and winter oats. The shopkeeper's wife, who had once turned away when Gwenna entered, offered a paper parcel of dried apples from behind the counter. "For your preserves," she said. "You made something fine out of that ridge." Gwenna accepted them with a nod. Outside, Cade was tying a coil of rope to the wagon rail. She handed him the parcel, and he tucked it beneath the seat without looking at her. "They're seeing you now," he said. "They're seeing us," she replied. That night they sat by the fire, the wind pressing softly against the cabin walls. Gwenna pulled her chair close and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said. "There's space behind the coop, flat and sheltered from the north wind." He looked down at her. "For what? A second building, maybe something with a window. I could use it for sewing or drawing, or maybe to teach if the neighbors ever want someone for their children." He traced his thumb along hers. "You want more than survival." "I want a life," she said. "One where we build and grow, not just get through the winter." He kissed her hair. "Then when the thaw comes, we'll start digging." It was mid-December when Cade surprised her with a small bundle wrapped in an old handkerchief. Inside was a silver thimble, plain but polished, and a folded scrap of paper with her name written carefully in charcoal. She unfolded it slowly. The drawing was of her, sitting beneath the pine behind the cabin, a book in her lap and her hair braided over one shoulder. "You never said you could draw," she said, voice catching. "I was watching you one evening when you didn't know." I wanted to hold that moment still. Tears pressed behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. "It's the kindest thing anyone's ever done." He touched her face, gently. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have." They married at home, just after the first of the year. Cade cleared space by the hearth, and the Harrows came with Mrs. Whitney, who brought a jar of pickled beans and a scarf she'd knit with leftover wool. The blacksmith stood as witness, and his wife recited the words from a tattered prayer book. Gwenna wore her winter dress with a ribbon at the collar. Cade shaved close and wore a clean white shirt. When he said her name, his voice didn't waver. When he kissed her, it felt like the world had gone quiet. After the guests left, they sat by the fire, just the two of them, and shared a supper of roasted squash and bread baked that morning. Snow fell against the window panes, muffling every sound. "You sure about this life?" he asked. She rested her hand on his. "There's no other life I want." By spring, the second building stood behind the coop, modest, but with windows on both sides and shelves built from pine. Gwenna turned it into a place where neighbor women came for help with stitching or to leave their children for a few hours. She taught letters to a pair of boys from the Harrow homestead, and in the afternoons, she sketched them while they practiced reading aloud. Cade built another fence line, took in a second horse, and helped a nearby family build their own smokehouse. At night, he read to her from the books they'd bartered for oats and flour, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the quiet patience in his voice. They aged gently together, like the land they'd come to know inch by inch. Their days were full of small work and steady joys: sweet corn in July, the first frost in October, the laughter of children chasing chickens through the yard. No one called Gwenna poor anymore. No one said she had nothing to offer, and Cade never rode on without her again. They slept each night beneath the quilt she finished that first winter. It seemed stitched with colors drawn from that ridge, the blue-gray of the mountains, the amber of sunlight through pine, and the deep, warm red of a heart found and kept. Together, they built a life that held.